Today it is Hebrews and HYKSOS. Now, before I jump into this topic, like many of the other topics I've talked about in the past, this is such a complicated area that most people avoid it. You'll see why in a little bit, because it can be a little bit of word salad or language stew, so to speak, when it comes to names of pharaohs and dynasties and trying to keep track of it all. So what I'm going to do is I may repeat some of the same things over and over again so you understand what's going on. It is also a fairly controversial topic because ideas of the HYKSOS interrelate with the Hebrews. As with everything, I will make sure that I document it all, and I will give you the sources as I go through this if you're interested in taking notes going on this. Now, I do have a little introduction here. I want to kind of read this off just a little bit because, once again, I want to establish, and then we'll be a little more free form. Ancient Egypt's Middle Kingdom. That is from 2055 to 1650. So 2055 to 1650 BCE, collapsed. So the second, so it's basically you have in the Egypt you have, of course, the Old Kingdom, you have the Middle Kingdom, and you have the New Kingdom. In between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, you have what's called the First Intermediate Period. And in between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, there is what's called the Second Intermediate Period, that each lasting about 100 years. So there is gaps between these various periods of time. You guys got that? It is during the Second Intermediate Period where the HYKSOS dominate. Okay, so the HYKSOS, this group, lead to the fall of the Middle Kingdom. They last for a little bit over 100 years. I say that intentionally because you'll see it's not exact and there's lots of controversy. So I'm giving a generality which will make sense later on. And the HYKSOS dominate Egypt during that time. The HYKSOS, of course, are not from Egypt. They are from the area of the Levant. Right? They speak a Semitic language. They worship Semitic and Canaanite gods and goddesses. They introduce many inventions into Egypt. And they're able to have much of Egypt, especially what is called Lower Egypt, and much of the Middle East at the same time. Okay, so the HYKSOS, in other words, had everything from Egypt around, especially around the Nile, all the way over through the Sinai Peninsula, up through what is Jericho, and even as far as Tel Dan and Gezer, which is near the border of Lebanon. That was all under the HYKSOS. So that area is united. This is making sense. So you got that. And then what will happen is there was an uprising of the native Egyptians, and they overthrow the HYKSOS, and as a result you have what's called the New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom, of course, starts with Ahmose I, the famous Pharaoh, and so we go there. Now the controversy, and I'll kind of outline a little bit because I know we'll be talking a lot about HYKSOS and not Hebrews right away, is the fact who entered in with the HYKSOS. Many will say that it is the Hebrews that arrived in Egypt at the same time as the HYKSOS. You guys got that? So at the same time that the Semitic HYKSOS come from Canaan, which is understood later on as Israel, right? At that same time, got it? The Hebrews also arrived because they are fellow Semites. They speak the same language, they have many commonalities, and they arrive at the same time. Then when the New Kingdom rises up and the HYKSOS are overthrown, at the same time the Hebrews who were with them during the Second Intermediate Period are also overthrown and, according to many beliefs, are enslaved at that time. That makes, along with Hyksos, which we have documented, which I'll go into. This is interesting. And then, of course, you're going to have a period of time where the Egyptians then, of the New Kingdom, attack the former lands of the Hyksos, and they conquer it. And this, of course, they conquer Canaan. Many people don't realize that Canaan then becomes Egyptian for over 350 years. Got it? 350 years. Meanwhile, those who are believed to be the Jewish people, we'll go into in a few moments, are believed to be enslaved in Egypt, further in, not exterior. But we'll talk about that because it gets more complicated. Because it turns out there are people who are Jewish. We'll talk about what that means in a few seconds, don't worry. Identify my terms. Jewish in other places. Got it? At the same time. Then what happens is that the New Kingdom will fall, right? The New Kingdom will actually start to be weakened by a group of people called the Sea Peoples. So it starts to decline. During this time, many of those who were slaves in Egypt, and we know this for a fact, it's not just the Jewish people, we'll talk about that. Other groups escaped as a result of the Sea People during the 1200s. Many people, many groups. It's hard because the Sea People destroyed everything. The Hittites, they destroyed Mitanni and other kingdoms in the Middle East. They destroyed everything and they severely weakened Egypt. Many people will claim then, after the 400 years of captivity in Egypt, it is during the 1200s when the Jewish people escape. And that's the Exodus. Is this making sense? Did I go slow enough? Is this okay? You guys got it? So this is the kind of the basic framework. But the question is, where is the evidence? And how can we prove it, or how can we disprove it? And so what we're going to do is we're going to be very fair with the sources. And as always, I say this with every one of my talks, nobody's going to be happy with me. So nobody is going to be happy with, because the evidence, archaeologists are very unpopular people. We don't like agendas unless you are supported by a group that will, give you special bonuses as a result of discovering certain things and overlooking other things. But unfortunately, it's not going to be too fun. But at the same time, you're going to learn a lot. Now, of course, I will go in here. Those known as the HYKSOS, as I said, were the direct cause for the chaos during the early 13th dynasty. Threatening Lower Egypt. Let's talk about this. Lower Egypt is north. Upper Egypt is south. So when I say Lower Egypt, that is north. That's where the delta is. Upper Egypt is south, and moving towards the highlands as the Nile River moves through. It's everything, and of course, that means in a sense their north and south is reversed. And they thought it was pretty interesting when they saw other rivers, they thought all the other rivers are flowing the opposite way. They should, It goes against convention. I mean, after all, rivers should be running south to north. Okay. The HYKSOS were Semites, as I said, originally from West Asia. They spoke a West Semitic language, the Levant. The HYKSOS king, Apophis, is referred to as the chieftain of Rietveld, which is another name for Canaan. The name HYKSOS is derived from the phrase Heka en Kaswit, which means ruler of foreign lands. These Semites appear to actually gradually migrated at first into Egypt, especially Lower Egypt. So it was a gradual migration, and then their numbers started to grow. We'll go over the archaeology involved with this, and became more and more, and then they started to refer, or I should say, make more connections with their kins further in. Is this making sense? And then eventually, they all became a little bit more rebellious. And so the uprising, in a sense, came from within, and then helped by the forces without. So this is a little bit more information here. Now, the first century Jewish historian Josephus believed the Hyksos were one and the same as the children of Israel. So this is a Jewish perspective from 2,000 years ago. They automatically thought Hyksos and Hebrews are the same. They're not, but he believed that. And I'll go over why. First of all, what he does is he quotes from a 3rd century BCE Egyptian historian by the name of Manetho. M-A-N-E-T-H-O. And I'll read the source right now. Manetho says, "They were a people of ignoble race who had confidence to invade our country," being Egypt, of course, "when they subdued easily without having to fight a battle. They set our towns on fire, they destroyed the temples of the gods, and caused the people to suffer every kind of barbarity. During the entire period of their dynasty, they waged war against the people of Egypt, declaring to exterminate the whole race. The foreigners were called Hyksos, which signifies shepherd kings." Unquote. That's pretty direct. All right, okay. So, while most scholars agree the Hyksos were distinct from the Hebrews, there are many similarities. First of all, they were both Semitic. Both Semitic. Speaking the same language with the same roots. And as somebody who's Hyksos would talk to somebody who's Hebrew, they would somewhat understand each other, much like if you're speaking Dutch to somebody who is German. You guys got it. So they are that closely related. So they could understand each other. Second of all, the Hyksos and the Hebrews are both from the Levant. Now I can't stress that enough. That means they're from the exact same area at the exact same time.
So what's the difference?
That's right. We're going to go into that. But they are in the same area. Right? Okay. And of course, Canaan, specifically. Third, the Hyksos took control over much of Egypt. Yet their pharaohs, unlike the Egyptian pharaohs, did not think it was proper to see themselves as gods. They thought there was a problem with that. And as you know, that would be the same with the Hebrews, right? They're not gods. So the pharaohs, the Semitic pharaohs, during the Second Intermediate period, were not worshipped as gods. Is that fascinating? Okay, moving right along. Fourth, the Hyksos used the donkey as one of their primary animals, as did the Hebrews, as well as the horse. And you may not believe this, but during the Old and the Middle Kingdoms, the Egyptians didn't use a donkey. And they'd hardly ever use the horse. These ideas were brought in by the Hyksos. In fact, a lot of our stereotypes of ancient Egypt are established by the Hyksos. And we go, oh, well, that's obvious. You'll see in a few moments how obvious this is. Okay, let's talk about a little bit about Canaan, okay? We know Canaan, this is where the Hyksos are from, and of course the Hebrews. We find evidence of Canaan in the Ebla tablets. These documents are from 2500 to 2200 BCE. It does mention the place of Canaan by name. So we do know that the Middle Bronze Age Canaan, which is 2100 to 1550 BCE, Canaan is called Canaan through various documents. We have another source, it's called the Mari Letters from around 2000 BCE. And it mentions also Canaan. Sometimes we're not sure if they're mentioning a people called Canaanites, or it's generally a land concept within those documents. I want to say that both the Ebla tablets and Mari, I want to make it very clear, they are archives and they're filled with references, and the reason why it has survived is because they were destroyed. And when you burn, right, you bake the clay and you preserve it for us. So the good news is these were destroyed, which preserves these documents. Also, we have a lot of evidence, of course, at a place known as Tel Dan. Now, I have been to Tel Dan. The first time I was there is 1986. And then later on with Claremont Graduate University, there's a lady by the name of Tammy Snyder, who was the vice president of ASOR for many years. Very well-known archaeologist. If you know the archaeology of Israel, works in Tel Afar and so forth. And when I was studying archaeology under her at Claremont, what did I investigate? It happened to be Tel Dan. And so I had to write all these site reports on Tel Dan. So I have little excerpts here, because it turns out the HYKSOS were at Tel Dan. This, of course, is near the Lebanese border, which tells us how far up the HYKSOS were, right? Taking a look at them, of course, you go, wait a minute, where are the Hebrews? Ah, we'll get there. All right, see? Okay, so we take a look, and we see that, first of all, we see these gigantic ramparts. These ramparts are earthen walls, and the HYKSOS are known for their giant earthen walls. It has a stone core about 6.5 meters thick and reach 18 meters in height from base to top. Then the foot of the outer embankment is about 27 meters from the core. The earth was then built up against this core, alternating layer by layer with reddish brown soil and debris of earlier occupations, and these layers were then sealed by travertine stones. And so pretty magnificent earthen walls, and these earthen walls are still there to this day. In fact, these earthen walls are all over Canaan. I just happened to observe that one specifically, although I did see another set of earthen walls at a place known as Jericho, consisting of the same materials, and are also for sure HYKSOS, because we find, not only do we date it, but we also find seals of the HYKSOS pharaohs intertwined within the soil. So we know for a fact that, again, this is a HYKSOS piece, so they're known for that. They're also known for creating an arch. They have, I saw in 1986, when the first time I was there, a triple arched gate from the Middle Bronze Age. I think my phone's off, right? It is. And the arch had a keystone. And I took pictures of it. And it collapsed the next year. It's too bad. But it was discovered in 1978. A great tripartite structure. We also realized that the HYKSOS, unfortunately I saw this too, had jar burial of infants. In fact, every single one of the domestic dwellings at Tel Dan had at least one infant in a jar under the house. But in some cases it had two. Now, of course, many people gloss this over and say, well, it's not human sacrifice, but we know it is. So the firstborn is oftentimes given up, and it's pretty obvious after a while. I won't go into the archaeology of Hasor, but the same thing. Hasor was another HYKSOS site during the Middle Bronze Age, which is contemporaneous to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. Gezer was another one. We even find evidence of HYKSOS as far up as Ugarit, and I mentioned before in Jericho, further down. Quite a bit in Jericho. We have found evidence of the HYKSOS writing, found in 3 places, all near or in Egypt, and dating from the mid-19th century to the mid-16th century BCE. We know that the script later on influenced South Arabian scripts and Phoenician. And we can make out some of it. Now, things that the HYKSOS brought to Egypt. This will be fun. And after I say this, you will be able to take a look at a lot of Egyptian art and be able to tell if it's New Kingdom or earlier. Got it? Okay, so here we go. So first of all, these Semitic peoples introduced the horse. Okay, so you see the horse in Egyptian art. That came with the HYKSOS and is only a New Kingdom phenomenology. Not an old, not a middle. Second of all, they brought the donkey. So if you see any donkeys, right, even when it comes to gods, got it? That would still be second intermediate and new kingdom. The Hyksos also brought something called, this is the big one, the chariot. That's right. The Egyptians did not use the chariot during the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Now you see all these images of pharaohs and their chariots. Guess what? That is after the Hyksos. These are new kingdom, third intermediate and on artwork. That's a big one. Right? That's a real good one. So yes, these chariots were pulled by 2 horses and usually had 2 men, one to drive it and one to shoot the arrows. The Hyksos were the ones who brought what's called the Hyksos socket battle axe. Now, the Egyptians and other groups, they had an axe, and then of course they had on top of it the blade that was tied to it up until we get to the New Kingdom. So that means that if there's a fight and you're using your battle axe, in many cases, guess what's going to happen? It's going to fall off, especially since in some cases it was made out of wood, right? You know, which is, you know, pretty messed up. But the Hyksos have something called the socket battle axe, where they forged the axe, the handle, and the blade as one. So that kind of took care of that. The Egyptians used copper up until the second intermediate period. They did not use bronze. It was the Hyksos who introduced bronze working, and of course the use of the bronze, the use of this wonderful battle axe, the use of a chariot, didn't give the Egyptians much of a military advantage. It gets even more interesting because they also had another another kind of feature, and that is a different kind of what's called a composite bow. With the Egyptians, you basically had the handle and you had, of course, the string, and you shoot. The Hyksos, what they decided to do is have this alignment, and they made it bend on each side, and they made it smaller. And so when you push it, the whole pole bends, and so does this, which makes it more efficient and faster, and of course better to aim as a result of that. Because of that, this bow was able to shoot at least 200 yards greater than the Egyptians, hitting their mark. So again, it's kind of like Egypt during the Middle Kingdom is still way back in time. It's not evolving that much. And here comes the Hyksos, and they're bringing all these advantages, and there's no way Egypt could withstand that kind of pressure. Right? There's something else that the Hyksos brought that the Egyptians did not have. That's called slavery. The Hyksos believed in slavery. The ancient Egyptians did not. Now, was there ever slavery in Egypt? There's only limited documentation when it mentions that if you are in debt, you could sell yourself as a slave for a short amount of time. That's a Middle Kingdom document. Otherwise, no. That means that during the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, all those great monuments you see, like the pyramids, were built by contracted labor. They're not built by slaves. If anybody tells you the pyramids were built by slaves, the answer is no. In fact, we have documents that talk about who built the pyramids, which are called mers, by the way. They're not called pyramids because that's a Greek word, pyramidus. And we know who built them, who designed them. We know how they built them. We know the work crews. We know in some cases the name of the foremen over each crew and how they organized themselves. And we have found their camps outside the pyramids. And we also found what they ate, and of course documents of how they got paid for it. Is this making sense? So wait a minute, but you're going, wait a minute, but the Jews are said to be slaves in Egypt. Well, that would mean it'd have to be the New Kingdom. See how that works? It cannot be the Old or Middle Kingdom because there is no slavery at that time. But once the Hyksos introduced the idea, then Ahmose I, we know from his own documents, enslaved the Hyksos that he captured and used them for his last 7 years of his reign to rebuild Egypt. And then later on, a pharaoh by the name of Hatshepsut, she used the same Hyksos force to rebuild the road system. And then her son Thutmose III also used these workers, and these are called Hyksos. So it's not up for any debate because it says, they say so over and over again. Is this interesting? So if we include the Hebrews with that, it's a natural progression. Are you seeing that? Because the Hebrews were allies with the Hyksos. Is this cool? All right. Okay, so we move on. I know it's so much to go through. Okay, so now the 13th dynasty of Egypt is 1803 to 1649. It was a very weak dynasty in Egypt. I'm going to drink some water here, sorry. Okay, very weak. And so it's a time of devastating plagues. It was a time of problems with the inundation of the Nile. Many records were lost. Okay, the center of the 13th dynasty was at Thebes in Upper Egypt. And we take a look, and the first pharaoh, his name is Usirkare Kandiar. Kandiar, by the way, is actually Semitic name. So we know already that by the 13th dynasty, you have a pharaoh that, even though this is supposed to be the native Egyptian pharaoh, he happens to have a Semitic name. So it tells you already there's been some infiltration. We know that during the 12th and 13th dynasties, that those who are Hyksos and other Semites are already, we'll go into the evidence in a few moments, already settling throughout the Nile Valley, especially around the Delta. So we know that they're there, and apparently they're already intermarrying into the various dynasties of Egypt, as you can see, especially with this name. You're going to have an interesting moment where many of these pharaohs will start to centralize their worship, whether it be under Amon-Ra or under Ptah, and you have almost like this, not monotheistic, but almost like this higher God concept that you're going to see in a very strong way amongst the Canaanites and the Hyksos, where they have an El and then the gods below that. You're going to kind of see that centralization going on already by this period of time. Okay. Well, you have, of course, the various overflowing of the Nile, as I mentioned before. But what I want to talk about is that you're going to have, eventually, during this period of time, during the 13th dynasty, you're going to have the Hyksos arrive. Now, here's where it gets complicated. You guys ready? Okay. So 13th dynasty are the native Egyptian dynasty. The 14th dynasty and the 15th dynasty are Hyksos dynasties. Got it? The 16th dynasty and the 17th dynasty are native ones again. However, the 13th dynasty, which is native Egyptian, in the area of Upper Egypt, is followed by the 16th dynasty, which is also native. You guys got it? Because it turns out that while the Hyksos dominated much of Egypt, you still have a native Egyptian dynasty that's contemporaneous, that's relegated further south in Upper Egypt. You want me to say it again? One more time? You guys ready? This is why people don't talk about this topic. Okay, so the 13th dynasty is the decline, right? Is the decline of the native Egyptians. They're about to fall to the Hyksos. And it falls, and the Hyksos arrive with the 14th dynasty. But lo and behold, at the same time, You have a 16th dynasty already starting in the south that's trying to do a native resurgence. Got it? And then what will happen is you get to the 4th to 15th dynasty, and then at the contemporaneous to that, you're going to have the 17th dynasty, still the native group. And they will eventually destroy the Hyksos, which will lead to the famous 18th dynasty of Ahmose I, which is the famous dynasty that we know so well of Tutankhamun and all the others. You guys got that? I know, it's kind of like mental gymnastics, which you can imagine when people are reading through this literature, you're going, wait, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, and then you read, 13th connected to the 16th dynasty, and they're fighting each, wait, what? This makes it a little bit of a mess. Okay, you guys cool with this? Okay, good. Okay, that's half the battle, believe it or not. Okay, so we move on. So let's talk about the Semitic 14th dynasty. All right, it was concurrent to the native 13th dynasty. That's going to also fall in the middle of it, and we're not going to talk about that. But what we're going to talk about is taking a look at a place known as Avaris. Avaris, A-V-A-R-I-S, will be the new capital of the Hyksos. So while the Egyptians have their Memphis and Thebes, Rheopolis, their Alexandria, it is of course, Avaris that is important. And we take a look at Avaris, and we look at the archaeology, and we realize that already in the 12th dynasty, right, you already have an influx of those who are Semitic and Hyksos into this town, as well as the surrounding region. Okay? And we take a look, and we see what are called donkey burials. So they're starting to bury donkeys. Now remember, there's no donkeys in Egypt. Well, 12th dynasty and Avaris and other places in the north, you're going to have donkeys brought in. Now they bury their donkeys for two different reasons. They bury them, first of all, because some of them love their donkeys. But some of them bury them in a ritualistic sense as a sacrifice. So you have two different kinds of burials. Those are done for your own, hey, I love my donkey. And the other is, I want to offer up the donkey to these gods. What kind of gods? Not Egyptian gods. We take a look at the temples, and we see the typical Egyptian tripartite division of a temple in these areas. So you have the forecourt, the inner sanctum, and the naos, or the holy site. But you're going to see also the old Semitic longhouse temple, which is all just one, and a place where there probably was a holy stone of some sort. So you're going to see that at the same time too. Once again, telling you. Now, the Egyptians, they did never sacrifice acorns. They just didn't do that. But the Hyksos did. So we see in 12th dynasty the beginning of acorn sacrifices, which was native, of course, to the indigenous areas. We also then start to see the mixture between Egyptian elements as well as Hyksos elements. We see also in the statuary, we see this rim haircut. It's like a Beatles cut, kind of goes around, which is a typical Hyksos Semitic cut. Pharaohs and other Egyptians would be caught dead with that. They'd have this hairdo. But the point is that there it is, right? And then we see a new kind of pottery type. This is discovered at a place called Tel Al Yahudiyah. So Yahudiyeh. It's a certain kind of ceramic. It's kind of a high brimware. And this ceramic was made by the Hyksos. It's also made by other groups who are connected to the Hyksos. And we're going to find that this pottery will be there in the Avaris area and other areas for a long time. In fact, we're going to see it even after the beginning of the New Kingdom. It's going to be there. made in areas, in a continual fashion, in areas where under Ramses, for example, or you're going to have it at work labor camps. So this is where basically those people who are slave laborers will make this pottery ware, which seems to be a connection between a group of people and pottery. During the 1200s, this pottery ware disappears from this region and reappears, and I've seen it myself, in what is now Israel. In different pits and places, like for example, at Tel Dan. All of a sudden you're going to see a burned area, and then you're going to see these pits. And in these pits, what happened is, you know, what you want to do is that when you destroy a place, you got to set up your tent. You set up your tent, you dig a hole, and you store your stuff in that hole. And usually it's ceramic. You put your pottery and you bury it because it's kind of like insulation. It keeps it nice and cool or warm during different temperatures. It's a great way to preserve it. And then if you forget about it, it gets buried, it gets destroyed. And then of course later on you dig it up and you find all these in pits. So yeah, we see this all over. Hatzor, Gezer, Tel Dan and other places. And it appears in the 1200s, and it does disappear in Egypt. So whoever makes it, does that make sense? No longer makes it. So this does prove that there is some kind of migration of the HYKSOS. Oh, see, I didn't say Hebrews, I said HYKSOS, right? So be very careful here when it comes to evidence. But now you have the pottery ware that you can identify. Okay, you guys having fun so far? Now let's talk about those graves. In the grave sites, once again, you're going to see a difference. HYKSOS at first, or whoever moved into this Abrus area, didn't get into mummification at first. So they just simply bury their dead. Or in many cases, they burn their dead. So no inhumation. I mean, you have a bit, then eventually they'll start to adapt over the 13th century to new strategies. All right. Okay, so now we move in to the 14th dynasty, which again is HYKSOS, right? So we go into that. Actually, we'll just keep going. So I do want to mention this. This thing gets a little interesting. There's a pharaoh of the HYKSOS. His name is Marabi Seshi. And Marabi Seshi, during this period of time, he is attacking the native Egyptians. And we have evidence from other sources that Seshi made an alliance with the Nubian Cushites. So it turns out that the HYKSOS had allies to the south. And they're attacking from both sides with, of course, advanced weaponry. So, and this is going to, of course, hurt the Egyptians. We look at him. I want to mention that Seshi, one of his consorts was known as Teti, and they had a son, by the name of Nishi, which means Nubian. So it looks like that not only that they have this war going on, or working together, Nubians on one side, HYKSOS on the other, but it looks like there was an actual marriage agreement moving in. It gets better because Neshi, known as just simply the Nubian, becomes the next HYKSOS pharaoh. Now it's interesting that the early pharaohs of the HYKSOS did not have a cartouche around their names. All pharaohs have a cartouche. It's believed as protective, protecting the name itself. But you know what? They don't care. They just have their name. They don't need to have the sacred perimeter. And again, as I mentioned before, they never take on divine attributes, which sets them apart from other Egyptians. So we don't have that. Okay. How are we doing here? Okay, good. Now, okay, so now we get to the Semitic 15th dynasty. Okay, you guys got it? The 15th dynasty, once again, you're going to have pharaohs that have Semitic names, Sakir Har, which relates to the idea of this is the pharaoh of the sacred mountain. And again, it's referring back to more of the indigenous beliefs that they had. You're going to have a certain pharaoh by the name of Kayen. He's the next one, who's also known as a ruler of the foreign land. It's pretty obvious. What's interesting about Cayenne is that we have his name everywhere. It turns out that he and the records about him show that he traded with a group known as the Minoans. It's another source of Minoan history. Just throw that one in. So we do have interchanges between him and the Minoans. We do have seals of him that are found in various sites on Crete. So he was very successful. In fact, in many ways, he makes the Hyksos into a powerful group, and they're able to dominate the majority of Egypt during this period of time. He is also pretty relentless. What I mean by that is they found at his palace skeletons of 16 human right hands buried in 4 pits. And what happened is he started a brand new concept. It's pretty cool, and that is that what you want to do is you want to prove that you killed somebody. So you cut off the person's hand, and then you put those hands and you put them in a little bag, and then you present them before the Pharaoh. Now, there's more than just the hand involved, because many of these hands have signet rings. Got it? So you know who they killed by seeing this. You know, so that kind of, they say, hey, did you kill? Oh, okay. Now, I'm sure at some points they just steal the guy's signet ring and cut off somebody else's hand. But the point is, no DNA evidence here. The point is, this is going on. Now, unfortunately, the Egyptians did this too, but not before the Hyksos. This is another fun thing that the Hyksos introduced to Egypt, and that is, I got to hand it to them. They came up with this. Sorry. Okay. But anyway, pointing the finger. You can. But yeah. So what will happen is that this becomes kind of a practice. Also, I just want to say something. We know. Okay, you know this hairdo right here, which I have alopecia, not much choice, but this hairdo was the popular one for the Old and Middle Kingdom. Most men shaved their heads. Most women did the same thing. It was the Hyksos that brought in the hairy individuals. The Hyksos made having hair on head cool. So this is why, if you look at the New Kingdom mummies, they have hair. If you look at the Old Kingdom or Middle Kingdom, they have hair that's about this long, and that's because, not because they grew it, but because if you know how we deteriorate, or you know, everything kind of pulls apart from there. Is this making sense? So yeah, so the hairy Egyptian is another introduction to the Hyksos. They really did change Egypt, and I think the funny thing is most of us have the image of ancient Egyptians from the perspective of the Hyksos contributions. Is this making sense? The Hyksos do contribute quite a bit. Okay, now when it comes to other things involved, the Hyksos, they worship a god by the name of Baal or Hadad. Now, of course, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. So Baal, of course, is known as the great storm and sky god, oftentimes associated with Hadad. In some cases, however, Hadad is associated with the higher deity by the name of El. So it gets a little bit complicated. So El sometimes is the all-high sky god, and his son is Baal, or his son is Hadad. But in some cases, Hadad is the all-high sky god, depending on if you're Northern Semitic, Eastern, or Western Semitic in your perspectives. Now, having said that, something strange happens. When the Hyksos arrive in Egypt, they're looking for a correlation, an Egyptian god that fits their all-high god. They're looking for another, Hadad, right? Another Baal. And they decide that Seth is the equivalent to Baal. You guys ever heard of Seth? Wait a second. Wait, what? Yeah. So what happens is as follows. Now, We go way back in time, not too far, actually pretty far, to the pre-dynastic period. And you're going to have the native god, the big patron god of the area of Upper Egypt, of course, is Horus, right? It's Horus, of course. And Horus is a great falcon god. Horus will be very quickly connected to the Pharaohs and giving them endowed with their spirit and their power, right? But the Pharaohs of before Menes, who unified, the Pharaohs of Lower Egypt worshipped Seth. Seth was the big one during the pre-dynastic period before Menes unified Egypt, and they saw him as the all-high, powerful one who initiates so many good things. In fact, Seth is believed even later on to be connected to the great sky god Ra and is his assistant. Now, Seth is also the deity connected to the desert, to the red soil. And wait a second, the Semites are from the desert. They find a kinship with Seth. So, as I die, what happens is Seth now becomes rehabilitated in the north by the Hyksos, and a lot of their names now will have the name Seth in it. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to rehabilitate the indigenous beliefs of Lower Egypt that was still there under the surface, that were pounded down by the power of Upper Egypt and Horus, and later on Isis and Osiris. And what happens, if you hadn't noticed, Isis and Osiris are not very big with Hyksos. Right? So what happens is everything is about Seth again. And so Seth worship is there. Now, he is still understood as a god of chaos, but a god that brings order to that chaos. He is the one who is a powerful one, and from destruction comes creation. You're going to see a lot of that with the Hyksos. Is this interesting or not? Yeah, moving on. So, I covered all that. Okay. You're going to also have another god by the name of Rasif, R-A-S-H-E-F, who is a god of war and thunder. And his wife is known as Etam, and their child is Min. And this is connected to Rasif, is connected to the one who slings and throws arrows to create plague. He is a plague god from Cyprus, but he is connected to not only Semitic, but other Indo-European gods that are connected to slings and as well as arrows, and connects to even an earlier form of Apollo. Just throw that one in. The word is actually mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Habakkuk, but your translators will say those translated as plagues in a general sense when it was intended to be a proper noun. So that's an incorrect translation. And what happened is in this story, it talks about there's a parade before El, and it's been proceeding to a place called Teman and Mount Para. And Rashaf is one of those who are led in the procession, obviously being controlled and attacked and in bondage. But what will happen is your translators will say, hey, we'll just make this generally, he sends the plague off to the mountains. Okay, anyway, so you got to realize there's a lot of agendas when it comes to translations. That is another one. Astarte is also worshipped in Egypt by them. Dagon is brought in as well. You even have Yam, who is the god of the seas. He is brought into ancient Egyptian worship. Mot, the underworld god of death, he is there. He's introduced. In fact, you're going to have that mentioned even also as a proper noun in the Hebrew Bible, and it's just simply called death, even though it's actually the name of a god of the Canaanites as well as the Hyksos. You're going to even have one called Kittish, Q-E-T-E-S-H. She is a fertility goddess of sacred ecstasy and sexual pleasure, and is associated with Astarte and Asherah. She is also a goddess that's connected to both Minoans and Mycenaeans. But it's interesting. She is depicted as holding snakes in one hand and a lotus flower in the other, both symbols of creation. And she's always shown in a frontal nude position, standing between men of Egypt and a Canaanite warrior of some sort. And then we get another one. You guys ready for one more? A knot is brought in to worship by the Hyksos. She's a war goddess and a virgin. She is a sister of Baal Hadad. She's understood as his lover, of course. In the tradition, however, a knot sometimes becomes wild and furious in battle. And like Kali, often gains bloodlust, cutting off heads, biting heads to her torso, like Kali does with her skulls, and wades knee-deep in blood. And she drives people out of towns, even old men, and her arrows are said to be full of joy. Okay. Now, of course, you know that a knot is going to combine with Sekhmet. You guys see this? So you're going to get the Sekhmet becoming more brutal in that aspect, but again, that's a Hyksos influence to Sekhmet. So we got to be very careful. The Hyksos gave a lot of interesting gifts. A lot of them not very good. So, you know. Yeah? Yes.
Can you I've been gathering from this that these are rather profoundly patriarchal people?
Yes, they are. In fact, I'll bring this up right now. In the Hyksos, in the place of Aberus and other places, we find when it comes to the burials, we find that men have proper burials, and they have a tradition in Aberus starting as early as the 12th dynasty into the 13th dynasty, and that is burying the women separate from the men in the outside courts. And sometimes not buried at all. Again, because they are patriarchal. One little bit of surprise, and we talked about this in other talks. Did you guys know the Egyptians were more egalitarian during the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom? Did you know that I did a talk here of all the Egyptian pharaohs that are female? It's quite a few. This starts to change, unfortunately, with the patriarchal group called the Hyksos. Again, another bad byproduct that they bring into Egypt, right? And then we get to the New Kingdom, and we make assumptions that, well, there must be some stratification society. This has always been the case because, no. Again, New Kingdom is a separate story altogether. There should be a book that just says, hey, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and then New Kingdom's a whole other chapter. It's actually a whole other civilization. It's very different. The Hyksos made a mark on these Egyptians, and again, not always a good one. Okay, so moving right along, or maybe not. The 16th dynasty, of course, you have the kings of Thebes in Upper Egypt, and they're going to eventually fight against the Hyksos, and we're going to see evidence of that. I'm actually reading through all the names, but I will say that there's a few interesting moments, but I don't have a lot of time for that. I want to make sure I get to the Hebrews. You're going to have, during this period of time, you're going to have a pharaoh by the name who's of the native Egyptians, who is from Upper Egypt, who of course loves Horus, go Horus, against those people who worship Seth. And there will be that rhetoric, by the way, because it will be the different gods fighting each other back and forth. And what happens is that he refuses to pay tribute to the Hyksos. And in doing so, he angers the Hyksos. Even though they're the Upper Egypt, they're constantly fighting the Hyksos. They're still paying them when it comes to tribute. This changes under this Pharaoh His name is, it's easy to remember, just think of Taoism. It's T-A-O, Tao. No connection whatsoever. But what happened is that what's going to happen is the Hyksos king, you want to hear this, Apophis, or Apepi, told Tao that his hippopotamus ponds at Thebes in Upper Egypt was keeping him awake at night when he tried to sleep in Avarice in Lower Egypt. Like, what? So he said, you know what? You know, your hippopotamus and your ponds in Thebes, they're keeping me awake. So you better remove those, because me, of course, who's 500 miles away, it's keeping me awake at night. This obviously is an exaggeration, but of course, then it gets worse, because he tells them to cease to worship Ra, directly in the inscriptions. So what happens is Tao decides to fight, and then the records break off. So what happened to Tao, who decided to fight against the Hyksos? Well, they discovered his body in 1886. They took a look at him. He died a violent death. About 40 years of age. We take a look. There's a blow from an axe from the severed part of his left cheek, which exposed the teeth, fractured the jaw, and sent him apparently senseless to the ground. Another blow seriously injured the skull, and a dagger or javelin cut open the forehead on the right side, a little above the eye. His body must have been lying there for a long period of time, because decomposition already set in, and the embalming had to be performed hastily. In fact, his brain was still in his skull. So he did not do very well. So this rebellion didn't work out, right? So apparently maybe the hippopotamus were removed. But this only made the next native Egyptian more upset, right? The next native Egyptian, his name is Ahmose. He ruled from 1555 to 1550. And he was, at first, he was going to go to war. For some reason, his war council, they were not into this idea. So they said, see, all are loyal as far as Kusay. We are tranquil in our land of Egypt. Elephantine is strong, and the middle part of the land is with us as far as Kusay. Men till for us the finest of their lands. Our cattle pastures in the papyrus marshes. Corn is sent for our swine. Our cattle are not taken away. He holds the land of the Asiatics. We hold Egypt. But Ahmose responds, I should like to know what serves this strength of mine, when a chieftain in Avarice and another in Cush, and I sit united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each in possession of a slice of Egypt, and I cannot pass by him as far as Memphis. No man can settle down when despoiled by the taxes of the Asiatics. I will grapple with him, and I may rip open his belly. My wish is to save Egypt and to smite the Asiatic. All right, so he goes to war. Interesting words. Apparently he means it. And so what happens is there is an attack. In response to this, Apophis, who's king of the Hyksos, he sends a letter to the Cushites. And so apparently it turns out that the native Egyptians of Upper Egypt are attacking the Cushites first from the south. And it says, do you see what Egypt has done to me? The ruler who is in it, Ahmose, the brave, given life, is attacking me and my soil, although I have not attacked him in the manner he has done to you. And it goes on and on. And so there's a fight going on. Well, Ahmose does die. And who takes his place is Ahmose I. Ahmose I, his brother, is the first Pharaoh of the new kingdom. And because his brother did such a great job, apparently unifying the native Egyptians, they were able to overthrow eventually the Hyksos. But again, I will say the Hyksos in connection in connection to the Pharaoh. Sorry, I'm just going to talking too fast. Sorry. So what will happen is this: is that you're going to have eventually the Hyksos are going to be defeated, and as a result of this, you're going to have the Hyksos being made into slaves. Well, let's go back to Apophis. Apophis is pretty much, there's one pharaoh after him when it comes to the Hyksos, but Apophis was the last powerful Hyksos pharaoh. Why is that important? Now we get to the Hebrew story. You see, according to the Genesis account, it is the Pharaoh before one who does not know Joseph that was when the Jews came in. Is that making sense? So it would be at this time, from a historical context, that you have the Hebrews joining the Hyksos, being overthrown, and then we get to Ahmose I. But of course, that could be an assertion. Are we ready for the evidence? Here we go. Okay, so Ahmose, what he does is that he attacks, he defeats the Hyksos, and he attacks the southern Levant. He wants to make sure that he destroys the area that the Hyksos came from. Because remember, the Hyksos, their region includes Egypt all the way through the Levant to Lebanon. So he wants to go ahead and take that region, and he does so. And of course, he attacks Avarice. By the way, it takes Ahmose, we know, from a soldier also known as Ahmose in his funeral stele. We know that it took Ahmose I 4 times to take Avarice, the capital. He attacked 3 times, gave up, attacked the Cushites, came back, and the 4th time the city finally fell. Then he attacked all the outposts all along, which is called the King's Highway, all the way to the Levant area and beyond that. In fact, the first thing he did was cut off the ones nearest to Avarice in order to isolate it so that people would starve. And we have evidence of that, people becoming desperate. And archaeology has revealed these outposts and the fact that they were destroyed at this time, and new ones were built by him as a result with granaries that were situated there to make sure that everybody had plenty of grain as they make their travels. But that's later on. Ahmose did what he did, and then he needed to rebuild Egypt. It's going to take a lot of manpower. I need to find a labor force to rebuild the mess that is Egypt. He thought, hey, the Hyksos introduced slavery. Why don't I do the same thing? Back, I have an instant workforce. A place known as Karnak, has ever heard of it? Was built, it existed during the time of the Middle Kingdom. It was rebuilt by Ahmose I. In fact, many sites in Egypt were rebuilt because they were destroyed by the Hyksos. And the last 7 years of his rule, he needs to have a giant labor force. And so as he's going up into the area of Canaan, he is also capturing slaves, and he loves leaving numbers. I brought back 1,000, he always keeps how many slaves he's bringing back to do the labor force. But there's a problem. The numbers do not add up to enough to do all the labor that he's having done. So there has to be another labor force, are you guys getting this, that is being utilized to build these monolithic sites, or I should say rebuild them, especially places like Heliopolis as well as others. Okay, so we take a look, and during this period of time, I mentioned this, Hatshepsut, who followed soon after him, has the same labor force, rebuild the infrastructure and roads of Egypt. And then as a result, Thutmose III, through 17 campaigns, takes the entire region of Canaan. It's now under Egypt. And I think it's fun because you take a look, you can actually go to Israel and visit all of these Egyptian sites that have, monoliths and obelisks and everything else. For about 350 years, the Egyptians owned Palestine. And just, is this making sense? And they left behind lots of their monuments. Places like Tel Dan again. Places like Beth Shen. Places like Tel Burna. But what about this other group? I think we set up the story a lot, but let's go into the Hebrews. We still have time. In fact, you need to know all of this, and I think you pretty well are putting the dots together, right? You're going to see how this really does connect. Anybody that happens to be Semitic during the second intermediate period is going to be flowing into Egypt during this time because it's geographically one and the same. Is that making sense? So no matter what group is Amorite, whatever, well, no matter what group, they're going to be flowing back and forth into Egypt, spreading their culture. And you're going to have same culture, same religious ideas, a lot of amalgamation. But there's something else. You have a group, now I mentioned the word Jew. Of course, the word Jew, Yoda, right? It does come from Jehovah, right? It does have this root, it has a religious meaning. And of course, you have that. So, and of course you're going to have, that's one word that's used quite a bit. But I want to mention that there's another word that is the earliest word for this group of people. And it is the word HABIRU. Ha-B-ru. They are one and the same as the Hebrew. Got it? You have the same consonants, the same sounds. One of the things that Tammy Snyder mentioned to me to all her entire classes is that a lot of people will try to keep the two groups separate and politically correct by saying HABIRU are these people and Hebrews are that people. But before I go there, let's go into the evidence. So I'm not just saying this blanket statement. Of course, you're going to have the story of Abraham, right? And the story of Abraham, it does start at Ur in Mesopotamia. And the story, supposedly, he lives around the 18 and 1700s. And then he goes into the area of western Anatolia. And he's there. And then he goes down into the Canaan, right? And then from there, the story goes is that by the Oaks of Mamre, he sets things up, which, by the way, is the center of El worship at the Oaks of Mamre. And then you're going to have the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? After Isaac, you have Jacob. After Jacob, Jacob has many sons, including Joseph. And what happens to Joseph, right? He has the Technicolor dream coat, right? He tells his brothers, hey, you know what? Your staffs are going to be bowing down to my staff, and I'm the moon and the stars are surrounding me. Things to make your brothers really happy with you. And because of that, according to the story, they decide to kill him. They change their mind because they like money. And so what they do is they throw him into a pit and sell him to some Egyptian traders, right? And these traders bring him into Egypt. Is this making sense so far? And then, of course, he arrives in Egypt. And in Egypt, he works for Potiphar's household, who's a prominent Egyptian. Potiphar's wife gets a little too interested. And there's a story where, he's running and she's basically holding his undergarment. So he's running away naked. This does not look very good. So then he's charged with, that. And so he is thrown into the lowest prison, right? And then he's there with two others, basically his Pharaoh's steward and Pharaoh's chef, the guy who made all the delicacies. The baker, chef, yeah. And what happens is, what happens there? Is that he has his dream, because you want to know, and he dreams that the baker is going to go ahead and die, but the steward is going to live. And then they tell him, well, obviously the steward, I'll remember you when I get out of here. And then the story goes is that he forgets. Then Pharaoh has this dream. Pharaoh has a dream. He has 7 fat cows followed by 7 lean cows. So there is a plague, right? has no idea what this dream means, as well as another one. And then, of course, the steward says, hey, wait a minute, I know this guy I was in prison with, and he can interpret your dream. And so they bring Joseph out, and Joseph says, well, the first 7 cows are 7 fat years coming out of the Nile. You're going to have lots of plenty, but the 7 years after are a famine. And with this famine, people are going to starve. And somehow this Pharaoh says, oh, okay, well, I'm going to make you in charge. Here's my signet ring. You're second unto all in Egypt, and you can organize the granaries so that there'll be enough to feed during the 7 lean years. You guys got that? This story wouldn't make sense at all, even if it's made up or if it's true. It wouldn't make sense at all with a native Egyptian. None of this would work. You guys got this? This would fit very much a Hyksos Pharaoh. Then, of course, arises a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph. And immediately they would be put to slavery. Of course, the assumption would be this would be Ahmose I. Is that making sense? But still, it's a great story, but I'm not giving you any evidence yet. So let's go for some evidence here, okay? All right, so, but you know the story. You guys feel refreshed? By the way, in the end of the story, obviously Joseph says, hey, it's not that easy. But eventually his family goes into Egypt, right, to stay. And then, of course, they're in slavery for the next 400 years under the next Pharaoh, who obviously would not be that one. We take a look at the story, and we find something interesting. And that is the word HABIRU. We find the first reference to HABIRU in 1850 BCE. It is in southern Mesopotamia, precisely where it said Abraham was at the time. That's interesting. They're mentioned as small bands of mercenaries serving local city-states, and they're given special provisions of food or sheep according to the ancient tablets. They are described as soldiers from the west. In fact, they're also known to have tribal affiliations, and they're known to be from the other side of the Euphrates River. In Hebrew, the word Hebrew means on the other side of something. That's exactly what it means in Hebrew. Now, of course, some people say it means on the other side of the Euphrates. Other people say, no, it's on the other side when it comes to purity issues. They are separate from that which is impure, and they're separate from those who are impure. There's different ways of interpreting these words, right? But at the same time, it appears in its context very close to the same time. And they are wanderers. Well, that's interesting, but we're not done yet. We take a look again, and I look at the evidence, and I find 200 references to the HABIRU in ancient literature. Not 10, not 50, not 20, but 200. That's a lot of references, yes.
Is it a Semitic word or Egyptian?
Huh? The word HABIRU is Semitic.
Okay.
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting. So it's transliterated into Egyptian.
Okay.
But it retains the same root, because we're going to go to the languages. For instance, the HABIRU is being used in this context in Babylonian, Semitic. Now the next one, here we go. I'm glad you asked that question because it goes right into the next one. The name appears in early records in northern Mesopotamia. A king, Urkbatim, of the Amorite kingdom of Yaphet, named the year that will be determined as 1740 BCE, the year when King Urkbatim made peace with Sumuna and the HABIRU. Now that's interesting because this again is very close to the Abraham, but it's also in the same area as the Haran, where we know Abraham was at. And once again, this is 1740 BC. Exactly. Is this interesting, right? Okay, let's keep going. Then we take a look, and we see, okay, the Amarna letters mentions, of course, there is a Canaanite warlord by the name of Labayu, who is a HABIRU, and he ended his status of Egyptian vassal under the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, which is 1353 to 1336, and assembled other HABIRU consisting of wandering, dispossessed people indigenous to Canaan. What I find is interesting about this, because you're going to see that there's HABIRU mentioned in Egypt, but it's also mentioned HABIRU as outside of Egypt. So apparently, if you believe the idea that Abraham, sorry, I didn't make nobody happy, Abraham brought everybody to Egypt, apparently he didn't, because there are HABIRU that are still being fought by the Egyptians under Akhenaten, who are waging a rebellion against Egypt in areas that Egypt had conquered, if you paid attention, obviously did, during the New Kingdom. Is this making sense? So you're going to see and one of these HABIRU people are called the Shasu, according to inscriptions. The Shasu are located in what is now the area of east of the Dead Sea and south a little bit. The Shasu, excuse me, it's interesting about them is because they worship a god by the name of, according to Egyptian records, Yahweh. In Egyptian. We're transliterating it. It is Egyptian. The phonetic form of the hieroglyphics. Is this making sense? What? But guess gets better. Because the Hittite records, wait, they're mentioned in Hittite records too? Yes. The Hittite records, there is mention of another group. Oh wait, the Shasu are mentioned in records from 1400 BCE. So I'm giving you a date for this. But the Hittites records mentions the HABIRU are mentioned in the peace treaty with Egypt. And it says the HABIRU gods, and it mentions them associated, these HABIRU gods associated with the name, hold your breath, Elohim. So you have one group of HABIRU connected to Yahweh, also known as the Shasu. We're Semitic peoples. And we have another group connected to are you guys getting it? El, or Elohim. Is this making sense? And of course, El and Yahweh are both connected to the God. Now, then we have an interesting thing, because Horemheb, who reigned from 1306 to 1292 BCE, he had these HABIRU working at two cities. In a place called Pithom and a place called Ramses. It's interesting because according to Exodus 1:11, the Hebrews were working exactly the two cities. The same ones. Coincidence? Is this good? Are you guys is this making sense? There's so much evidence for this. It's ridiculous. And I'm sitting there in class, my archaeology classes at Claremont going, how come more people don't know this? Because it's not very popular. It gets more interesting. Because it turns out, all right, as we go through the records, is that you have the brink, and this is called the Sea People. After the 400 years, you're going to have Egypt, and Egypt is going to be attacked by the Sea People to destroy the Hittites and the Mycenaeans and many other groups. I like to tell that story, but it's a whole other lecture. But what I want to say is this weakens Egypt, and they lose the entire area of Palestine. They lose that area. So now it's open for occupation. So it's open for an exodus to go there. Is that making sense? So it would be an exodus in that context. But is it known as Israel? Yes. Uh-oh. Wait. Who calls it Israel? Menetef. Who's that? It's Egyptian Pharaoh who is fighting against the Sea Peoples. And he calls them, of course, those who are Israel. In fact, he says, of course, here it is, here. He says, Canaan is captive with all woe. Ashkelon is conquered. Gezer seized. Yanoam made non-existent. Israel is wasted, bare of seed. And that, in the consonant sense, it was I-S-I-R-I-A-R. It's absolute. If you know Egyptian phonetics, the hieroglyphics, it is Israel. this is connected directly to those who are the HABIRU. Is this making any sense? We also know from records that the HABIRU suddenly appeared, guess where? That area during the 1100s. Right? But now you're going, okay, well that seems to make one other group happy. No, because I'm not here to make people happy. Okay? We take a look, and we look and we realize you have these colored ware jars, these vases, these ceramics that do leave Egypt at a time and go to the other place. This is where I'm going to mess things up big time. You ready? Okay, well, this migration took forever. It took 80 years, but then again, maybe it does correlate. It took about 80 years for the material to go all the way from Egypt. There seems to be different groups that swoop across much of Israel over a period of time. And so different cities fall at different times. It turns out that these HABIRU met with other HABIRU who are already still in Canaan the entire time of the 400 years and joined forces. This changes the story quite a bit. So basically you have those who are Jewish ran into others who are Jewish who are on the other side joining together. No, it's going to get more complicated because with those groups, it turns out we know from inscriptions that a lot of people did not like the Egyptians and hated being under them during the time in Canaan. They rebelled too, and in some cases we have evidence that they burned their own cities. And they joined this other group. So now you have Canaanites who worshiping Baal and Asherah, joining side by side with indigenous Shasu and HABIRU, in addition to these new groups who came from Egypt, and all together are throwing off the Egyptians. And then, we're not done yet. Then one group of sea people, they arrive and they decide that they want to conquer the area of the Gaza Strip. And they're known as the Philistines. And they set up their group there. You guys got it. So it turns out to be a giant migratory mess that's created as a result of the vacuum of the destruction of the sea people to not only to the Egyptians, but the Hittites as well as the others. So it is a very messy story. But it would explain, in a very strong way, why you see in the Hebrew Bible the consistency of two different cultures. The popular culture is still very much worshiping Baal and Asherah, right? And not following the dietary restrictions because it turns out they were all together working in this rebellion. And so this mixture will continue even stronger when it comes to what's called the northern kingdom of Israel. So you're going to have Israel after the so-called kings. You're going to have a division, a divided monarchy, and the northern kingdom will be more closely aligned to the Canaanite indigenous beliefs. And we can see that through the material culture in a big way. So there you have it. So did the HABIRU or Hebrews exist? Yes. But not in the way that you would expect. The historical archaeological record is a very mixed bag. It doesn't make anybody happy. But at the same time, it gives us a wonderful context for understanding these people and their contributions. At the same time, none of this would be possible without the HYKSOS. The HYKSOS are the ones that made the fact that the Hebrews could be part of all these kinds of contexts possible, right? And also, of course, emphasize them when it comes to a plight story, which you see with the 400 years in slavery, which is very empowering from a Jewish perspective, right? So you got the story and you got the glorious victory, although the glorious victory is probably more shared than it should be. And we see the evidence, but then again, history has a way of rewriting itself, and eventually the Canaanite aspect is written out, as well as those, those HABIRU that hung around, that stay there, who we know their names, who are freedom fighters, who are constantly fighting the Egyptians on the outside. We forget their legacy, which is rather sad, because you can't believe that all of them got into Egypt. And we know historically that's not the case. And we have their names. We even have a list of names and what they did and what they contributed to and the various battles that they won under, of course, the context of being known as the HABIRU. I hope you learned a lot, and thank you so much.